So what do you do when you take a photograph that looks like this and you want it to look more like this? Well, we call on a very clever bit of software, Luminar NEO, and we get into our photo editing. On one hand, you have people who are very much photography purists and you have to capture the image perfectly in camera. But I see the raw image that I capture in my camera more as a stepping stone to the artwork that I actually want to create. So if you're new to photo editing or just interested to see the steps I take to level up my photography and take it more into an artistic piece, then stick with me and I'm going to walk you through exactly what I do inside of Luminar NEO. So let's dive right in and get into it. I was passing by this winery in the North Island of New Zealand and all of these converging lines just really called to me. While I liked the composition, I really wasn't happy with the lighting and I had absolutely no control over that other than returning back to the site later, and that just wasn't an option for me. In my mind's eye, I was imagining how great this would look if we had a setting sun just dropping behind the hill here, illuminating some beautiful clouds or something like that. And so now I'm back home on the South Island of New Zealand. My challenge in this video is, can I recreate that kind of image here in Luminar NEO? So the first thing I'm going to do, as with any of my edits, is to jump into the Develop Raw section. And the first thing we want to do is to apply a camera profile that matches our camera. And I am normally a big fan of the camera neutral profile. However, for this one, I think I'm going to go for camera standard. And if you're unsure of the power of applying a camera specific profile to your image, just look at the difference between the Adobe standard and you look at the blue in the sky here. Look how washed out and tepid that is, or even with the Luminar default profile, that's not much better either. If you want to get the best color accuracy out of your image, you're much better off to go for something that matches your camera. So here, camera standard, just look at that. The blue suddenly reintroduced and the colors are much more vibrant and authentic. So that's what I'm going to kickstart things with at the moment. From here, I'm just going to make some general adjustments just to get the base of my image looking pretty good. Now, before I start manipulating the whites and the blacks, I've just pressed J on my keyboard just so that I get the highlight clipping warnings and the shadow clipping warnings. And unlike normal, where I take a global approach and try and get my whole image looking good and protect my highlights so that I'm not blowing out any details, in this instance, I'm really not concerned about the sky at all. I just want to make sure that the foreground and the hills here look good. And so I'm going to try and maximize contrast in this area. So the fact that I'm actually lifting the whites in this instance and blowing out the sky, I am not worried in the slightest. I'm going to boost the blacks up a little bit as well, just to get a little more interest in the trees here. And now I'm going to scroll down, jump into my curves, and if I want to make sure that we've got a pure black point, I'm just going to actually grab the left hand side of the curve here that represents the blacks, and you can see that if I push that all the way over, we're just pushing everything into black as denoted by those blue warnings there. But I just want to move this over just until that point just starts to meet the very edge of our histogram, and those trees are looking very black, so I may actually just lift the shadows a little further again. And if I scroll back down, that means we need to adjust that bottom point for the black point there. And that's pretty good for my contrast. Now I can move on to the color balance. And as I said in the last video, even if you know that you want to warm up your image or cool it down, I prefer not to do that in this initial pass. I prefer to have a color accurate white balance at this point, or just a very subtle shift one way or the other. You really don't want to get too aggressive with the temperature slider at this point. You just want to keep it pretty accurate. But I will increase the saturation slightly and the vibrance. I'll come down to the sharpness. It's a good idea to introduce a good bit of sharpening. Then we'll call that done for the initial raw develop. Now, before I go any further with my editing, the next thing I want to do is to composite the sky that I want into this background. And that's really easy to do inside of Luminar NEO, as you guys know. So we're going to come up to the Sky AI tool, and you may find that down here in the creative section, which is where it normally lives, but for me it's sat here in favorites at the moment. So I'm just going to open up the Sky AI tool, and the first thing we want to do is come into the sky selection. I'm going to go straight past all of those nice blue skies, and I'm going to look for a more appropriate sunset. And this one here may work well, so we'll just drop Sunset Clouds 3 in. And that's not too bad for an initial introduction of that sky, but I can see a few gaps down here around the horizon and a bit of fringing around the trees. And so to correct that, all I'll need to do is just grab this global slider and start to move that to the right. And that's pretty much cleaned that up, so I'm pretty happy with that. We have the option to relight the scene based on the colors that we have in our sky here. And so while I don't want to go to 100%, because I really don't want to lose all of that lovely interest that we have in our foreground, I do want to start introducing some of that. So maybe we'll go around that sort of 67 mark, that's fine. And down here in the sky adjustments, we have the option to warm the sky up slightly if we want to, cool it down. I'm pretty happy with where it was, but perhaps we want to just brighten it up just a little bit. Okay, let's have a quick look where we came from and where we've got to. So this was our before, this was our after. That's the compositing part done, super easy. Now we're ready to get into our creative editing. Yes, for sure, Luminar NEO ships with a set of skies and you can absolutely use those. However, I would use them with caution because they stand out like a sore thumb. Anyone who uses Luminar NEO, they're going to recognize those skies. So get hold of a really good sky library. I'll put a link in the description to the one that I use and I think is a very good sky library. But I'd also recommend it's highly beneficial just to start building your own sky library as well. So when you see a beautiful sky, beautiful sunset, beautiful cloud formation, get your camera out, try and get as high as possible so you can see as best you can to the horizon line and get a shot of it and start building your own sky library. Let's press on with our creative edit. So while we're heading in the right direction, one of the things that I think we really need to tackle here is the vibrancy of the greens we have going on. And so if we jump into the color section and come into the hue section where we can directly influence colors specifically, and if you don't see these options here, it's probably that you have this HSL collapsed, so you just need to click it. That'll open up all of these options where we have hue, saturation and luminance controls. And you guys probably know this, but just for reference, the hue allows us to change the color. The saturation allows us to change just how intense that particular color is. And the luminance is just a fancy way of saying the brightness. So we can control just how bright that color is as well. And we want to jump into the hues and I want to control the greens. And so if I start moving this green slider here, you can see that we can introduce even more green by pushing it towards that cyan side. Or here, if I take it to the left, we're just sort of pushing it more towards the yellows. And I can probably do the same here with the yellow slider as well, because oftentimes the greens and the foliage don't exist just solely within that green slider. There's a lot of yellow in there as well. And then I'd like to try and brighten up the yellow lines we have running through the field. And so for that, I'm going to jump into the luminance section, grab the yellow slider and push that to the right. And straight away you can see that all of those little plants, whatever they are, they get brightened up. You see that? And I quite like that. Maybe if we try pushing in the orange, okay, that's brightening up the soil in the field. So I may actually want to get some more contrast by taking that in the opposite direction. Probably don't want to go too far with that. And let's have a little look what we've achieved here. So this was our before with the very green hills, and this is our after, where purely for aesthetics, I've tried to better match the colors in the fields just to match the sky a little better. And so it's working for the color areas. However, we do still have a problem here, and that is that the shadows are very dark, very black. And the question is, how are we actually going to push any color toning into those to match what we've got going on in the sky? So when you're compositing a sky into your own work, one thing to consider is the illumination that's happening in the foreground is all coming from the sky. So that's why I pulled a lot of that green out of the fields there and pushed them more into the oranges. And one of the things you'd notice with the sky that we've introduced here is we have a duality of a color scheme here, which is oranges for the highlights, and in the shadow areas of the cloud that you can see that aren't lit by the sun, the color there is blue. And so that blue would be evident in the shadows that we have in our foreground. And currently in our foreground, the shadows are all pretty much black. So how do you push color into what is effectively black? Well, we're going to do that with curves. We're going to lift up the blacks and then we're going to force blue in there. So let me show you how you do that with curves. So you find the curves in the develop section and we have access to 4 different curves. The first one on the left hand side here, this purely controls the contrast and the brightness of the scene. Basically this is our luminosity control, where we can brighten things up, darken things down and control the curve that way. So we could add more contrast into our image if we wanted to. And if you've made changes and you want to get rid of it, you just double click the points and they're going to disappear. We also have access to the color channels, which is our red, our green and our blue, and it's by using a combination of the blue channel and our brightness channel that I'm actually going to be able to push in color into these shadows. So the first thing I want to do is actually lift this tone slightly. So I'm going to click on the grey and white dot here, and from here I can grab this very bottom point, which, as you know from earlier, controls our shadow point. And if we start taking that up from the bottom, keeping to the left hand side of the graph, we're actually going to brighten up those shadows. And so I'm going to lift it up ever so slightly, and because I don't want the whole image to get brighter, I can put another point on just slightly higher up and just bring that back down so it's closer to the line that's running 45 degrees from the bottom left to the top right. And now we're going to come into the blue channel and we're going to do a similar thing. We're just going to lift this bottom point up. So if I take this bottom point and I start pushing it all the way up, you can see just how much blue we can literally inject into this photo. That's far too much, but you get the idea. So what we want to do is kind of match what we've got going on in the sky, But you'll see another problem we have at the moment. If I take this all the way up, we're not only introducing blue into the shadows in our foreground and our land elements, it's also affecting the sky, and that isn't what we want. I just want to keep the sky as it is and just make these changes to the foreground. So what am I going to do? Well, of course, I'm going to make my changes first of all, and then I'm going to mask it in. So I'm lifting those blues up ever so slightly. It just needs to be a little bit subtle, and again, pull this handle down in the middle, put a point there, bring that back so we're only affecting the shadows. And if we want to see what we've done, we just toggle the eye tool. So this is our before, this is our after, and you can just see that we've introduced just a subtle blue wash into those shadows. But like I say, I don't want it in the sky, and that's where our AI masking is going to make this really quick to do. We're just going to click on the Mask AI section. It's going to analyze our image for us. We're going to have all those crazy geometric shapes kind of work their way over the file while Luminar does its maths. And there you go. It's analyzed it. It's found all these elements for us. And all I want to do is select the sky. And if I jump back into adjustments, you'll see that we now don't have that effect that we just created. It's been taken away from the foreground. It only exists in the sky. Well, not a problem. We want the opposite of what we've done here. So by coming into that masking section and jumping out of the actual Mask AI section, we now have access to all these mask actions. And that is where we can literally just come and invert the mask. So if we show it so that we can see our mask, if I click invert, you'll see that it just swaps it round so that we have the opposite of what we created. It's basically saying select the sky and then just select the exact opposite of that. And so now if I jump to adjustments, now we have exactly what we want, which is that blue pushed just into those shadows. And now we have that selection and we look at our before and after. If we want to make any fine adjustments to these curves, we can do that, but I'm just going to leave it as it is for this video. When I'm working on these kind of edits where I'm taking it much more in a creative and artistic direction, I'm looking at my photo more as if I'm a painter approaching a painting. The idea being, what would I like to look at? What do I think is actually going to look good in this image? And for me, I'm imagining that the sunlight is coming over the hill and it's going to be kissing the foreground, a pocket of light, if you will, on the field. And when you're making these changes, one of the keys for actually getting it right is to ask yourself, would there be a reason that we would have a lighter area on the field? And for me, I'm thinking absolutely, because the sun is just dropping below that hillside, so there may be a ray of light that may just still be picking up some of those elements on the field. So I want to go for it. Okay, let's scroll all the way to the bottom here, where we're going to find in the Professional tab the Color Harmony tool. And there's some really great color tools in here, but we're going to work with the color contrast. So let's grab the amount slider and start cranking that up. And you can see it just starts sending things absolutely crazy. However, the only area that I'm really interested in is somewhere here on the field, where we're going to imagine that the light is just beaming down here. Guys, if you're new to my channel and you like photo editing, why don't you hit the subscribe button? And if you're new to photo editing and don't have Luminar NEO yet, but like the look of it, I have a discount link in the description below, so go ahead and help yourself to that. I also get a small commission from that, and it helps me to keep creating this free content for you guys. So thanks very much. Let's carry on with the edit. So as I often say, it's a really good idea to crank the amount all the way to 100, because that's going to allow you to better see the changes that you're making as you shift through any of the tools. And then from there, once you're happy with your look, then you can ease it back to the actual amount that you want. And so I'm just going to leave that at 100 and play with the hue. And I'm just looking at the contrast level between the little seedlings and the soil. And I'm just wanting to play with this until I get this kind of where I want it. And if at any point you lose sight of where you came from, you can always just toggle the eye tool and then pop it back on and go, oh yeah, okay, we're heading in the right direction. That's pretty strong, but yeah, that's kind of what I'm after. So now I can tease that amount slider back and forth until I kind of get that sitting where I want it. And when I'm doing all of that, my eye isn't interested in any of the other elements other than what's going on where I'm going to be masking this in. And so now it's time to jump into my mask. I'm going to grab a brush and I'm just going to paint the effect in where I want it. So I'll make sure that paint is selected, and we can go with a strength of about 50%. Make the brush a little bigger. And now I'm just going to click and start painting. And obviously the red represents our mask. And when I release, there we go, we have that effect painted in, and that's painted in with 54% at the moment. And so I'm just going to do a subsequent pass and again, and just sort of build this up. And if you've overcooked it in any area, which I think it is on the right hand side here, you can just switch to the erase version and just brush it out with the erase, and I might take it away from the edge there as well. And then we can just check where we came from and where we've got to, where we came from, where we got to. Pretty subtle, but I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, I think it's time that we start focusing on bringing our viewers' attention in towards the actual sunset element. And so I think the best way to approach that would be to put a vignette around the outside to darken it. But one of the things I really love about Luminar NEO's vignette is that we can actually brighten that center point. And not only that, we can tell Luminar NEO exactly where we want that center point to be, so we can position that bang in the center of that sunset. So let's do that. So let's close the color harmony tool and scroll up to vignette. And just like last time, I'd recommend that we go whole hog on the amount slider. However, for the vignette, we don't want to brighten the edges, we want to darken them down. So come into the negative territory, but go all the way, and then we can play with our size and kind of position that as we want it, and the roundness as well. Now, if we go to the left, we're going to create more of a rectangular look, and if we go to the right, we're going to create a perfect circle. And I think that's what we want for the sunset here. Now, this is the important thing. We want to grab the inner light and start pushing that up, because that's going to brighten the center point. Now, at the moment, our transition from bright to dark is far too abrupt, and so we're going to grab the feather slider and just push that to 100, and that's just going to make our transition just a little bit softer. And one thing I haven't done yet is choose our subject, so I'm going to click that button, and that's going to allow me to just click around our photo and say, hey, this is where I want the center point for that vignette. And so I'm going to come right to our sunset, click bang on the middle of that, and there we go. That's positioned it so it's centralized around the sunset. And now we just need to grab that amount slider and play with that until we get it to the point that we're happy with. Okay, I like the darkening around the edge, and now I just need to ease this inner light off as well. So let's play with that and make sure that we're happy with that. I want to brighten things up, but without blowing them out. Okay, let's toggle our before and after, before and after. There we go. Right, it's starting to come together, but where would a sunset picture be without some sun rays? And Luminar NEO is among the best tools out there for just quickly getting in some sun rays. Oh, AI sun rays, thank you. Right, let's do it. I really love this tool. It's so much fun to play around with. Let's grab the amount slider, crank it all the way up, and very importantly, we need to place our sun center. So here you go. As I move this around, you can see exactly what the sun rays do, and let's bring that down, and we could either position it where we see the brightest part in the sky, but what I'd like to do here is actually just drop it just below the actual horizon line. And now we've got it in place, we need to refine our look. So let's scroll down here, let's grab the sun rays length and make sure we're happy with those so we can bring them in nice and tight, or what I prefer to do is just push that out through the whole image. That's nice. The penetration slider allows us to have more penetration. And who wouldn't want that? Get your mind out of the gutter, boy. But seriously, this slider just refers to how much the light rays actually penetrate through the clouds or any other environmental object. And so just setting that somewhere around 34, that's fine for this. But one thing I really want to do is actually warm these rays up. And so grabbing the sun rays warmth slider and pushing that to the right, obviously is going to introduce more yellow and orange. So it's just a case of getting this to the point where you feel happy with it. And now coming back to the amount slider and just setting that somewhere that you think that looks good. And also sometimes just playing with that overall look, because that's darkening down almost like a vignette and bringing our viewer's eye in towards the sun when you take it to the left, or if you take it more towards the right, it's not darkening your photo at all. And so I normally like to take this up just slightly higher, maybe around that 66, and then we're able to refine things with our mask. So I just click on the masking section there, click on the brush, and now I'm able to just paint this effect back in. So if I just click once over the sun here, that has literally erased everything apart from that one click, and now I'm able to just paint and start building this effect back in. So although you might have thought, wow, those sun rays are really intense, very extreme, going over the whole photo, you don't have to introduce them everywhere, and you don't have to introduce them with the same intensity through your whole photo. You can literally paint them in. And that is exactly what I'm doing here. So I'm not painting any of those rays that were coming down into the foreground, just up into the sky. And then if we want to just taper it back a little bit, we can go to the erase tool, maybe drop our strength, click once, and then just bring that out from around the edges. Any of those rays that you just feel is just a little bit too much, just a little bit too obnoxious, just bring them back in to line with a little bit of the erase. And now we can have a little look at our before and our after, and just check that we're happy. Look, that's okay. Now I'm going to share with you a technique that I often use for my landscape photos, and that is to actually darken the foreground just slightly. And areas that are darker just hint to the viewer saying this area is not quite as important. And so by darkening the foreground and brightening into your scene, it actually leads your viewer's eye in. And we have a really great tool to enable us to do this inside of Luminar NEO, and that is the Relight AI tool. And Luminar analyzes our scene in 3D and allows us to darken down or brighten up the foreground. We can do the same with the background, darken or brighten it. So it really does give us a lot of control. So in this case, I'm just going to darken down the foreground and then grab the depth slider and just move that back and forth and just determine how far in the scene I want that darkness to encroach. And as always, toggle the eye tool just to see your before and after and make sure that you're happy with your changes. And if you've gone too far, just ease it back a little bit. All good. It's a very fine line between not going far enough with your edit and completely overcooking things. And I must admit, I am pretty guilty of going too far in many occasions. However, Neo is such a fun tool to play around with. I get carried away. I really enjoy just finessing the image and seeing how far I can take it. So I'm just going to quickly throw on a couple of my favorite tools just to try and finish this off. And then we'll look at an absolute before and after and see if we like the results. Let's do it. Okay, let's add a bit of the dramatic effect. I do like this one, but normally this is just a little bit too much, but it's really great for like black and white and just adding a bit more contrast. So how about we keep that relatively low? Here's our before. Here's our after. Yep, I'm happy with that. Now what about a little bit of fog coming across the field there? So let's crank the amount to 100. And again, amazing that Luminar NEO is able to sense three-dimensional space. Obviously, I don't want this up in the sky. I just want it on the field. And so we have the option to come in here, and I'm just going to go for layered fog so that it's just laying on the field. Perfect. And so let's just tweak this back and forward, back and forward. Don't want this too light. Also, we don't want it to look too grey and muddy, somewhere around there. Look, now let's just come into the amount slider and just introduce just a little bit of this. We can grab the mask again and just erase it from the areas we don't want it. I feel like the foreground overall may be a little bright still, so let's come back up to the develop section and we'll grab our curve again. Just because we've been using that in this tutorial, we'll just keep on with the same tool, and I'm just going to pull that down just into the negative territory. It's going to add a little bit of contrast as well as that darkness. And let's jump into our masking, and this time I'm going to grab a linear gradient and just pull that effect over the field, over the hills, and it's just going to taper out from 100% here, 50% where this center line is, to 0 here. And so that's just going to be a nice smooth transition. And if we jump back to the adjustments, we can see just that. And I still feel like we might just want to introduce just a little bit more blue into the shadows here. And so again, we can absolutely do that just by clicking on that blue tab there in the curves and just boost that up ever so slightly. Now, in the same way that we're able to introduce a bit of blue into the shadows, we can actually also pop colour into the highlights, even the very brightest ones, the whites. And so let me show you how I do that. I can't do it here because we've already masked this one out. So I'm just going to close that develop tool. That's going to move into my edit section and be available here. And now I can click on develop again, and it's going to invoke a brand new instance of the tool. I have access to everything all over again, and it's going to apply these changes over the top of the whole image rather than where we'd masked it previously. And this time I'm going to grab the highlight section for the blue tool, and rather than pushing it over towards the left, which is going to bring in more blues, I'm going to pull it down. And as I bring that down, you're going to see that we go into the realms of the yellow. So that might be perfect for what we want over the sun. And that's going to affect the whole image. We can do the same with the blues in the shadows and just bring that up and really force in a blue-yellow color scheme. Now, one tool that hasn't really had a look in my edits recently has been 𝗨𝗀𝗻𝗄. Absolutely unbelievable AI tool. Really love this one, the Accent AI slider. And this is a great editing tool to kickstart your edit. If you're unfamiliar with how to use the develop raw setting, you can always use Accent AI instead to edit that initial stage. But you can also use it right at the end of your edit just to add a little bit more pop. So let's look at our before and after with that. Really subtle, but I do like it. We can also grab the sky enhance slider and use that as well, but in this case I don't think I need to do that. absolute final touch now. I'm just going to open the mystical tool and just add a little bit of that dreamy goodness that this tool brings. Look, if we crank that all the way to 100, you can see exactly what it does. Again, far too much. You never want to push it all the way to 100 for a full edit, but it certainly lets us see exactly what the tool's doing, and then we can go, okay, how much of that do I want? And normally that toggling left and right just to see what it's looking like is going to enable you to better settle on where it should sit for your final edit. Let's go somewhere around that 17 mark. Here's our before, here's our after with that tool. Awesome. Woo, I got a bit carried away there, but here it is. This is going to be our before and after to see what we're actually able to achieve with a photo we thought was pretty average to start with, and we've sculpted it and crafted it to look more the way we wanted it to look. So here we go with our before and after. Here's our before, here's our after, before and after. That's a huge change. You might like it, you might hate it, but I really hope from this video is that you've learned something and enjoyed it too. If you have, please let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, you probably like the one that's popping up there. So hopefully I'll see you in that one. Cheers guys, catch you there.